Welcome. My name is Grandma Storm. I write stories for young adults. Today I am reading chapters 41 through 45 in my book, The Book of Faith. "41. The Story of Tirzah and Ashiel. Tonight was the eve of the time of congregation. The great hall was ready. The adornments, the diversions, the speeches, the feast were prepared. Tirzah dreaded it. She had been sitting for the Royal Academy of Artists for hours. Locked away in the artists' quarters in the northern rooms of the palace, she perched on a replica of the royal throne. Dressed in a heavy blue gown, she sat on a raised dais. On every slender finger flashed rings of precious stones. Behind her was a tableau of statues, draped silver cloth, and jeweled caskets of various sizes. A crown of brilliant diamonds sparkled above her fair brow. Tirzah held an exquisite baby doll, gilded in gold, swaddled in silver, and adorned with rubies and turquoise. The dear Queen's keeper of the royal collection stood nearby to make sure nothing happened to the bejeweled baby. Shrouded light from the overcast day entered through tall windows. Stretched canvases were stacked to the ceiling. Props, cans, easels, paints, brushes, compounds, and oily rags littered the floor. 6 ragged artists surrounded Tirzah, each bent over his canvas. Tirzah thought the official portraitists tiring people. They insisted she sit perfectly still. She was hardly allowed to breathe. She was sick of the smell of oils and varnishes. She was sick of holding the baby doll. She was sick of the keeper hovering over her. Then the sculptor arrived. He came to take measurements of Tirzah for a work newly commissioned. The sculptor was issued a deadline that he insisted, quite loudly, was impossible. He was denied an extension. He was desperate to do studies on Tirzah. Bickering ensued. The artist insisted she could not be spared for a moment. They had their own quotas to meet. Bickering bloomed into shouting. Shouting shifted into scuffling. A pot of paint was thrown at the offending sculptor. Tirzah realized no one was looking at her. Handing the baby doll to the keeper, she allowed herself the luxury of a good yawn, stood up, and stretched. A collective gasp filled the air. The artist turned from the sculptor and screamed at her. "A whole day's work ruined! Stupid girl, what do you think you are doing? Sit down." With that diversion, the sculptor rushed the dais. He pulled a bit of string out of his tatters, measured Tirzah's arms, and secured a circumference of her head. This was too much for the painters. They ran forward and seized the sculptor. Props fell, paint spilled, canvases trampled. Once the sculptor was bundled out the door and the room returned to order, the painters began again. The keeper handed her the jeweled baby, and Tirzah sat on the throne. 3 fussy old men were comical, thought Tirzah. The diversion of the sculptor was funny. Once or twice she slipped into a smile that ruined the concentration of the 6 artists. But her thoughts were not all on the amusing scuffle or the silly old artists. Her thoughts turned to someone else. "Stop that! No smiling! Sit up!" The light from the northern windows faded. Painting was done for the day. With a collective grunt, the painters dismissed her. Out the door and away from the painters hurried the girl. Tirzah turned down the center of the great hall. Actually, walking down the center was all that was possible. Chests and crates, tubs and trunks mounted to the second balcony. Some stacks were more precarious than others and were buttressed with a board or two. If it were not for the massive stones supporting the foundations, all would have tumbled to ruin long ago. The only wonder of the architect's design to be seen was the open galleries high overhead. Skilled hands, long folded in their graves, had carved lacework in stone and lighted it with clear sheets of leaded glass. Over time, the stone carving in the galleries cracked. When it rained, in seeped the water. When it frosted, ice nibbled the stone. Except for a few servants shuffling about in the galleries high above, no one was there. In the low light, the festoons for the feast of the eve of the time of congregation did not look quite so shabby. The decorations were dragged out of storage every year, hung in the same manner every year, and stuffed back into the same trunks every year. Tirzah glanced at the servants. They looked as faded as the ribbons. With a smirk, she wondered if they were stored in the musty trunks right along with the buntings. Everything was old. Every one was old. The artist and sculptor were old. The keepers were old. The servants were old. The dear queen was. She knew thoughts like that were dangerous, but she could not help but think them old and ugly, scary ugly. There were more pleasant thoughts to entertain. Her mind fled to them, or rather to him. Tirzah wondered if she would see Ashiel tonight. If only she could see him, that would make all the weariness bearable. Tirzah reached the end of the great hall and stood before the silver doors leading into the outer gallery of the dear queen's special collections. She was not interested in the collections. She was interested in the door. She came to study her reflection. It was not a very good image, but it was the best available. She had never seen a true mirror and did not know such things even existed. The occasional vague reflection was the best she had. She wanted to see what the painters saw. Her white blonde hair was pulled back from her face and tightly braided with gold ribbons that flowed down her back. The fair forehead, which gracefully bore a crown, was high and a bit haughty. Her blue eyes were large and expressive. The reflection was far too dull to reveal it, but a curious mark was delicately formed by tiny blood vessels below her right eye. It was in the shape of a tear. Even when she smiled, the mark remained, making others wonder if she had just finished a bit of a cry. The tarnished silver doors, however, could not dull the beauty of 16 years. She stood before the doors and smiled at youth and health and strength. "I never want to grow old," murmured Tirzah. She swayed, turning a critical eye to her velvet gown. She never had a choice in what she wore. A lady-in-waiting decided, but she liked this gown. It was gray and blue striped velvet, overlaid with heavy silver lace. Gold ribbons embroidered the high collar. The dear queen's own seamstress made numerous alterations to fit her tall, slender figure. But she longed for something new. Anything new would be welcome. A bit ruefully, she wondered if anything new existed. Her thoughts returned to Ashiel. She closed her eyes. Her heart quickened, and she found she wanted to dance. She swayed to the music rising within her. She wondered, was he thinking of her? Would he think her gown pretty? Did he think she was pretty? She lifted her eyes to the tall ceilings and laughed. She was silly. How could she be so frivolous after all that had happened? She turned to the door and shook a finger at her image. Behave yourself. You lack all sense of gravity, admonished the tarnished reflection. Despite all the tragedy, loss, and suffering, she rejoiced that Ashiel lived. Her thoughts turned to the first time they touched. That was 2 years ago. Exactly 2 years ago, they touched fingers, right there. Her eyes glanced to the spot, and her feet danced across the floor, to stand just as she remembered. She held out her hand to the open air and closed her eyes. She had not completed her training at that time. It was her first feast of the eve of the eve of the time of congregation. She found a spot to stand in the great hall when, at the start of the night, she saw him. Ashiel lived. When she first came to Topeth, all she desired was death. Each night she stared into black space until sleep took her. In the morning, her eyes struggled to open to the light of a new day. Tirzah could not escape life, so she accepted existence. The royal historians of the Deer Queen recorded the event that brought Tirzah to Topeth as the Deer Queen's majestic victory on the shores of Chinneroth. The enemies of the Deer Queen instead knew that day as the massacre of the village by the sea. In that tragedy, Tirzah's village was robbed of its strength and youth. Like the other subdued holdings of the Deer Queen, all that were left were old and bent and tired. And then 2 years ago, she saw Ashiel. Across the room, their eyes locked. He was taller, his face more serious, yet it was Ashiel. Tirzah was not sure if her legs could support her, but the blessed eve of the time of congregation brought her Ashiel. Nothing else mattered. Tirzah heard little of the speeches that night and barely gave the correct responses at the correct times. At last dismissal began. As he passed, their fingers touched. 42. The story of Tirzah and Ashiel as children. Whenever the work in the boats and the fields was done, the children met for battle. Ashiel led one army, Tirzah commanded the other. Well, hardly armies. Ashiel boasted of 3 followers, Tirzah of 4. They were all children, but they saw themselves as the fierce warriors, while their fathers talked of crops, weather, and fishing. The children played war. They knew the Deer Queen ruled the land of which their village was an outpost on the edge of the sea. They heard their fathers talk of her, but they dismissed her as far, far away. The Deer Queen did not bother them except for gifts during the season of congregation. Even then, gifts were not collected every year. Round leathers rarely visited. There was always time to run into the wood or take to the sea. When they did come, the brown leathers would steal a few gifts and go away. Ashiel assumed the role of a king. Tirzah took the part of the Deer Queen. The other children followed. Whenever they could, Ashiel and Tirzah paraded their troops on the hard sand washed by the sea. They stole out of their cottages late at night to hold secret councils with their troops. They led their opposing armies to skirmishes in the woods. They ambushed each other among the boulders by the sea. Once on a summer sunset, with the sand firm beneath their feet, when the wind and the waves were warm, a challenge to race was declared. The children cheered their king and queen. Stride matched stride. In the golden light, Asriel looked to Tirzah. He caught the gleam in her eye and whinnied like a wild horse. She laughed, slid to a stop, and ran into the waves. He pivoted to follow her, only to be greeted with a well-aimed lump of sand. They began as wild horses pawing the ground. Then one bolted away to be pursued by the other. With a backward glance, the two watched the other children try to catch them. They never could. Soon they would be alone with the sea and the sun, running with the wind. They felt they could run forever. 43. Do you see something? I? What is it? A coracle. There is a man aboard. A surging current carried the small, round craft. The fishermen felt the lift of the water under their vessels as the coracle swept past. They were mesmerized by the strange sight of a man no one knew. As one, they realized the boat was heading straight for the bay by their village. They hauled in the nets and rowed for home. By the time they made shore, the stranger had landed and was talking with the old women. A baby played in the sand by his feet. The men rushed to the cluster of people surrounding the stranger, ready to defend their own. But the old women were nodding and laughing, seeming quite comfortable with him. "Stranger," demanded one of the men, "who are you? Why are you here? From where have you come?" Stranger turned to him and said, "I stole away because I wanted, for the love of my king, to be on pilgrimage, I cared not where." They did not like this talk about stealing. "Who is your father? Where are your brothers?" "All that serve my king are my brothers, my sisters, my father, and my mother." What could this stranger possibly be talking about? Every village man knew every other man, and his father and his father's father. How could this man claim a kinship through a king? Besides, there was no king, only a dear queen. "Where is your village? Where is your roof?" challenged another man. "Like my king, I have neither roof nor place. I come to dwell with you for a time. I have come to share your burdens." "You talk strangely. How can you take our burdens? Are you a slave or an ox?" "You do not look like an ox," declared one. "At least you don't smell like an ox," mocked another. A third laughed, nudging his neighbor over the joke. Ignoring the comment, one of the old women muttered, "Who is this king? There is only a dear queen." "May she ever be praised," was quickly chorused by all. The stranger looked into the old woman's eyes and said, "I am a slave to my king alone, and a servant to all I meet. I come here to live his life among you. And I brought a book." How had they missed it? The stranger had something in his hand. It was bound in dark leather and flashed gold in the sunlight. Hans reached for it. He held the book over his head for all to see. "What is this book?" queried one. "Give it to me," demanded another. The stranger opened the book and showed the villagers pictures and writings. Closing it, he hugged it to his chest. The stranger did not mean to give his book away. This book tells powerful stories of my king. Allow me to live among you. Allow me to be your servant for a time. I will serve my king by serving you. Allow me to tell you stories from this book. You will never be the same again. Was this stranger safe? What was this talk of a king? What were the stories he wanted to tell? How could they change? Was change good or bad? As they pondered these questions, the only sound was the breaking of waves, the song of birds in the air, and the prattle of the baby playing by the feet of the stranger. Now, who will have me? Whom may I serve? Who will hear my stories? The mild challenge lay upon the air for some time. Tirza's father stepped forward. Come with me, stranger. Come to my roof. Stranger, for that was what they called him, from that day to the last, went to Tirza's house. He offered no other name. It did not occur to anyone to ask him. So he was Stranger. Tirza's father asked Stranger to mend nets. The man was skillful and diligent. Stranger ate at the family table. They saw he took little. He was given a blanket and put in a shed for the night. Stranger was content. He asked for nothing in return. He only took what was freely given. Others soon sought his help. If someone needed their goats herded to the pasture, Stranger did it. While the mothers worked in the fields, he cared for the little children, teaching them songs and games. Some took advantage of Stranger and ordered him about. Others thanked him for being helpful and gave him what they could spare. He responded to good treatment or ill with a gentle smile. More than the man's work, his games or songs, the villagers enjoyed the stories of the book. On summer evenings, he gathered the people along the shore and read from his book. On frosty nights, they gathered in the headman's home. Stranger read them stories by the fire. He told stories of bravery and tears, of sacrifice and noble deeds, of love and betrayal. The stories explained how they came to be, why they were there, how to live life, and where death would take them. From the oldest villager to the youngest child, no one tired of hearing stories from the book. Stranger said he came to prepare the people for the king. He said the king was wise and good. He said the king wanted to establish a new law in their hearts. He said the king wanted them to turn to him whenever they were in need. Stranger described the king as a good shepherd. Stranger acknowledged the villagers were skilled fishermen, but the king fished for men. Through good times and bad, Stranger said they should trust the king. He taught them that all things worked according to the king's purposes. Some things they understood. Some things remained puzzles. Stranger taught the people a song from the book. When the men pulled on their oars and sang upon the open sea, they said the song made them stronger. When the women sang in their homes, they said their work was easier. The children ran through the village shouting the song. Perhaps they should not have done that. There was one that did not like it. Established is the world, is steadfast place to hold. The king from everlasting art, his throne is fixed of old. The seas have lifted up, they make a mighty wave. The waters fill a cup or make a watery grave. Yet the king on high more mighty far is he than the thunder of the waves or the breakers of the sea. While their nets dried on the shore, the fathers gathered to discuss this king. Stranger sat with them. When asked if the king was coming soon, Stranger said the king could come at any time. This issue of time seemed most peculiar to the fathers. They asked Stranger for clarification. He only said soon. That did not satisfy the men that wanted to know exactly when. Stranger admitted time was easily misunderstood. Soon, the best explanation he could give to them. Stranger asked if the people wanted the king to rule over them. Would they submit to his laws and his ways? Did they have more concerns he could address? The men all agreed. Stranger answered every question with satisfaction, except the one about time. They needed to think, to discuss. The fathers debated leaving the rule of the dear queen and inviting the king of the book instead. The dear queen is far away, mused one father to his fellows. I see no advantage of her rule. She does not help us in any way. The king, says Stranger, offers to assist in our time of need. See, he's already sent Stranger to help us. Yet I am conflicted. What think ye? Granted, the brown leathers do not come every year, but there's always the possibility of the dear queen's demand for more gifts, observed another. In reality, we have ruled ourselves with little interference from her for many years. Why should we leave her? All we ever see is an occasional brown leather. Just remember to hide the little children. What is the loss? What is the gain? Pondered a gray bearded man. And look, this king offers to teach us a new way, a better way. Stranger says the king loves children. Stranger is kind to children. Perhaps the king is like Stranger. A servant is never greater than his master. I say we should invite this king. At least we should send word to him that we are interested in his laws and his ways. Why ask for change? Argued another. I think there is more risk than gain in asking this king to rule over us. So the talking went. The fathers thought all that sat around the circle were trustworthy. But the traitor looks like any other man. Stranger stayed in the village 1 year. Then he said he must go to prepare others for the king. Stranger asked for the final time. When the king came, for surely he was coming, would they take him to be their ruler, or did they want to remain under the rule of the dear queen? In the end, the fathers voted to accept the king. Stranger bowed before them. Late into the night, by a grand bonfire, he read the people their favorite stories. Together, they sang the songs he had taught them. One by one, they fell asleep by the fire. When they awoke, Stranger was gone. One left that bonfire and slunk away to the dear queen. He had a covetous heart and wagered there was more to gain from an existent dear queen than some uncertain future king. His journey to Tophet was long and hungry. Bitterness was his bread. Manson was his name. On his arrival at the city gates, Manson told a keeper of the subversives at Chinneroth. Manson was hustled from keeper to keeper, retelling his story each time. Gossip of his treasonous tale spread and inflamed the city. The dear Queen's school of scholars assembled. Manson reported before this august assembly of greywigs that a king plotted to usurp the dear Queen. He further accused a treacherous man named Stranger of openly traveling to villages with a book. The scholars inquired of this book. Manson said the book told stories of a king, his laws, and his ways. Dangerous propaganda, noted the scholars. Manson further reported the fathers of the village agreed to leave the dear Queen and follow the king. This was undeniable treason, declared the scholars. If this infection of lies were allowed to live, it would spread. The dear Queen was informed by her chief counsel, Dr. Luce. With Dr. Luce's guidance, the dear Queen decided treason must be destroyed. The members of the dear Queen's school of scholars dismissed Manson. A keeper showed him out the door and into the custody of a brown leather. A traitor is forever marked as untrustworthy, apostate, turncoat, deserter, even by those who benefit from his betrayal. No one has use for a traitor. Manson was escorted to the office of Dr. Luce, where he was rewarded with a trip to the camps. Upon the dear Queen's command, brown leathers marched from the valley of Hanam over the Dog-Tooth Mountains to the vast plain, coming at last to the little village by the sea. It was the season of frost. The attack began before dawn. Pulling back their bowstrings, brown leathers shot flaming arrows into barns and sheds. Fathers awoke to the squeals of their livestock. The men ran out of their cottage into the waiting swords of brown leathers. Women screamed, babies wailed, children knew what to do. They were taught to run and hide. In the confusion of fire and black dawn, Tirzah ran. She made it to the edge of the wood where brown leathers caught her and dragged her to a cart. Other girls were there, shackled inside a cage. Tirzah fought, but the brown leathers only laughed. She was thrown in with the others, and the cart pulled away. The soldiers had scanty provisions for themselves for their journey back to Tophet. They had less to give the children. For some, the spark of life flickered out. Upon arrival at the palace in Tophet, Tirzah was pulled from the cart. What happened to the others, living and dead, she never knew. Brown leathers took them all away. Tirzah was starved and dirty, but her white blonde hair yet glowed. Her high forehead and long limbs were unblemished. Despite suffering, her blue eyes displayed spirit. All Tirzah saw about her in Tophet was a confusion of broken boxes, bulging baskets, rotting barrels, and sagging chests. What she wanted to see was food. An old woman dressed in tatters motioned for her to follow. Tirzah's legs were weak as sticks, and she crumpled to the ground. The woman ordered a brown leather to carry her. What will happen to me, wondered the girl. If I am to die, why do I yet linger? Weaving their way through piles of confused junk, they came to a black door. The old woman knocked and entered, showing the brown leather where to stand his burden. A sickly green bulb lit the room. Under the orb was a wide desk, clear of all except one sheet of paper. A man sat behind the desk. The brown leather bowed and left. The tattered woman remained. She motioned Tirzah to a chair by a small table and stood behind her. Time shifted slowly as the man wrote. Finally, he nodded to the old woman. The collection of rags limped out of the room. Reappearing, she set a tray with a loaf of bread and a flagon of wine on his desk. Tirzah focused all her attention on the tray. She would do anything for that loaf of bread. Yet she was afraid to simply take it. She lifted her eyes to the man. "Please, sir, may I eat?" The man was of average size, of average weight, of average age, and of average color. He was dressed in a black robe with no adornments. On his head was a black cloth cap. When he lifted his head, his eyes coldly essayed her. She felt shame welling up inside. His gaze accused her of terrible sins she had never even imagined. It was clear she disgusted him. Tirzah dropped her eyes and studied her thin hands curled in her lap. Finally, he spoke. "My name is Dr. Luce. What is your name?" "Tirzah." "Tirzah, do you want to live?" "No, but I want to die eating and drinking." "However, you are living. Would your father want you to live?" "Yes," was the whispered reply. "You will serve the dear queen. If you do what this woman tells you to do, you will live. You will live as your father would desire you to live. Give her the food." The old woman fetched the tray and set it within Tirzah's grasp. In her weakness, Tirzah could not lift the loaf to her mouth. The old woman broke off a piece and fed her. The bread was good. The wine was better. The man was talking. Tirzah did not hear him. "You are to be prepared to be the dear queen's mirror. Her old mirror is, shall we say, losing her luster." Dr. Luce continued with instructions that Tirzah did not understand. She had bread. She had drink. Her ears were filled with the sound of chewing. The old batch of tatters heard and understood. She had seen it all before. A new one to train. She did not feel like living herself. Looking at the back of the girl, the old woman sighed. Tirzah fell asleep in mid-bite, as the old woman knew she would. She left the room to fetch a brown leather. She could not carry such a big girl by herself anymore. Tirzah did not find death, so she resigned herself to life. As Dr. Luce instructed, the old woman fed her, washed her, and trained her. When her training was complete, Tirzah became the dear queen's mirror. 44. Whenever they could, they met. After that first time in the great hall 2 years ago, Ashiel made it a point to learn Tirzah's schedule as the dear queen's mirror. The palace was a perfect warren of musty hiding places. Soon they established a time and place to meet in secret. Hiding behind towering baskets and tumbled trunks in a remote room of the dear queen's palace, Ashiel told Tirzah about his journey to Tophet. Just like her, he was locked in a cart and hauled away with other children. Upon arrival, like Tirzah, he was taken to Dr. Luce. He did not know where the others went. Ashiel explained. He was assigned to the scholars, where he was drilled, tutored, and tested. Though he did not die in the attack or on the journey, he thought the endless philosophical recitations of the scholars would certainly dispatch him. To his disappointment, he lived. She nodded, understanding how he felt. However, when the scholars introduced the study of mathematics, something awakened with him. Tirzah did not understand this, but was glad to see his eyes brighten as he talked about his studies. Theorems, algebras, cycles, analysis, operations, tangents, primes, and constructions consumed him. He saw functions and geometries as tools for thinking. Language was one thing, but with numbers he discovered new possibilities for communicating his ideas and calculations. Dr. Luce learned of his progress and directed the first scholar to concentrate Ashiel's talent into horology, the study of the measurement of time. As Tirzah stood pondering these memories in the great hall, her hand yet extended in the air where her dancing feet had taken her. Her mind returned to the moment. It was the eve of the time of congregation. Yes, she must see him tonight. A dimming of the greenish bulbs that illumined the great hall interrupted Tirzah's reverie. The room swayed. There was a surge of light and a popping sound as several of the bulbs burst, showering shards of glass on the dear Queen's collections. What was happening? With a start, she realized she would be late for final preparations if she did not fly. Lifting her skirts, she raced through the great hall, avoiding stacks of trunks and piles of stuff as she went. Weaving her way through the labyrinth of the dear Queen's collections, Tirzah slowed her pace to climb the stairs to the dear Queen's apartments. 45. Ashiel wondered if a person could die from boredom, because the droning of the scholars was killing him. He was only 18, but he felt 80. They sat in a windowless chamber of the University of Topeth. Ashiel was the only student. There were others, young men like himself, but through various transgressions they were sent to the camps for restorative education, remedial tutoring, instruction in clearer thinking, or something like that. He stifled a yawn, shifted in his chair, and brought his focus back to what the first scholar was saying. It seems that eternity does not differ from time, for two measures of duration cannot exist together unless one is part of the other. For instance, 2 days or 2 hours cannot be together. Nevertheless, we may say that a day or an hour are together, considering hour as part of a day. But eternity and time occur together, each of which imports a certain measure of duration. Since, therefore, eternity is not a part of time, forasmuch as eternity exceeds time and includes it, it seems that time is a part of eternity and is not a different thing from eternity. The first scholar's watery eyes were clouded and his back was bent. The black velvet robe hid deformities that were evident when he walked, or rather shuffled. Gold ribbons fringed the collar of his robe and proclaimed his status. Looking at the first scholar, Ashiel thought the man was well-intentioned. In a way, he was fond of the old guy. He even felt sorry for him. Actually, he felt sorry for all of them, himself included. The first scholar was only doing as Dr. Luce instructed. No one questioned Dr. Luce. In fact, it was a good idea to avoid Dr. Luce. The scholars and their students sat at a round table littered with papers and books. A bare bulb hung above, shedding green light. The other scholars affected various poses of attentiveness. Ashiel was pretty sure the one on his left was dozing. Strict attention at all times was to be maintained in the university. It was more than a rule. It was law. He stretched his legs. He needed a run. The second scholar added, further, according to the philosopher, the now of time remains the same in the whole of time, but the nature of eternity seems to be that it is the same indivisible thing in the space of time. Therefore, eternity is the now of time, but the now of time is not substantially different from time. Therefore, eternity is not substantially different from time. Further, as the measure of the first movement in the measure of every movement, as said in physics, it thus appears as the measure of being. Eternity is the measure of being, but the being of things corruptible is measured by time. Time, therefore, is either eternity or is a part of eternity. Recitations are eternal, quipped Ashiel under his breath. He knew it was time for the dozing scholar to recite. It would be dangerous for the man to miss his part. Ashiel reached his long legs under the table and charitably kicked the man in the shin. With a start, the sixth scholar began with a squeak. On the contrary, eternity is simultaneously whole, but time has a before and an after. Therefore, time and eternity are not the same thing. The man gave Ashiel a slight nod and continued. It is manifest that time and eternity are not the same. Some have founded this difference on the fact that eternity has neither beginning nor an end, whereas time has a beginning and an end. This, however, makes a merely accidental and not an absolute difference because, granted that time always was and always will be, according to the idea of those who think the movement of the heavens goes on forever, there would yet remain a difference between eternity and time as arising from the fact that eternity is simultaneously whole, which cannot be applied to time. For eternity is the movement of the permanent being, while time is a measure of movement. Supposing, broke in the third scholar on cue, however, that the aforesaid difference be considered on the part of the things measured and not as regards the measures, then there is some reason for it. Hence, added the fourth scholar, if the movement of the heavens lasted always, time would not be of its duration, since the infinite is not measurable. It would be the measure of that part of its revolution which has beginning and an end in time. Another reason, said the fifth scholar, for the same can be taken from these measures in themselves, if we consider the end and the beginning as potentialities. Time always goes on, yet it is possible to note in time both the beginning and the end by considering its parts. If only time would move faster, mused Ashiel with a sigh. Thus we speak, added the sixth scholar, of the beginning and the end of a day or a year, which cannot be applied to eternity. Still, these differences, that eternity is simultaneously whole, but time is not so. It was his turn. Ashiel entered into the recitation. Such a reason would be a valid one if time and eternity were the same kind of measure, but this is seen not to be the case when we consider those things of which the respective measures are time and eternity. He continued, the now of time is the same as regards its subject in the whole course of time, but it differs in aspect, for inasmuch as time corresponds to movement, it now corresponds to what is movable, and the thing movable has the same one subject in all time, but differs in aspect a being here and there, and such alteration is movement. Likewise, the flow of the now, as alternating in aspect, is time. But eternity remains the same according to both subject and aspect, and hence eternity is not the same as the now of time. Well, son, well said, young Ashiel, commented the first scholar. I believe it is time. Thinking himself a lively wit, he paused for a little chuckle that became a cough, that turned into a choke, that caused Ashiel to jump from his chair to fetch a glass of wine for the first scholar. When the first scholar regained his composure, he said slowly and carefully, I believe we have time. He suppressed any thought of humor and rasped, for a practicum or two. Gentlemen, shall we? The scholars filed from the classroom and shuffled, limped, and hobbled to the dear Queen's Royal Horology Laboratory. The first scholar unlocked the door and flipped a switch. Flickering light revealed tables piled with gears, springs, and tubes. A slate board, covered in ratios and formula, hung at the back of the room. Clocks of all descriptions dangled from the walls or lay in various states of assembly on the tables. The clicking and ticking, the automated talk, and the clacking of gears made the air alive with a mechanical cacophony. The scholars and their student assembled before the blackboard. Gentlemen, intoned the first scholar in a quavering voice, Dr. Luce informed me of his interest in our progress on the regulator. Setting all else aside, he commands us to press forward. He believes we have discovered the unifying theory of infinity and interval. Ashiel, you are to be congratulated for your innovative observations in horology. Dr. Luce believes your progression of ratios is of particular interest. Please demonstrate on the blackboard and then in the installation. 6 gray wigs nodded in unison. Imagine all these years and we have finally achieved our goal, shouted the fourth scholar into the fuzzy ear of the second scholar. The second scholar bobbed his head enthusiastically. Gentlemen, said the first scholar, we owe much to this remarkable young man. 6 gray heads nodded in unison. The 6 scholars were on this quest for decades. It was not until this boy came to Tophet that they achieved the progress Dr. Luce demanded. For the next hours, 6 scholars and their pupil huddled at the blackboard. Ashiel demonstrated the strength of his theories as wigged heads bobbed in excitement over the numbers and symbols scratched in powdery chalk. This boy was going to save all their necks and keep them far from the camps. Now to the regulator, exulted the first scholar as he led his comrades to the back of the laboratory. The first scholar pulled away a black silk cloth, revealing a large glass box. A mechanism of twisted wires was knitted with jewels, gears, and sprockets. Ashiel reset dials and adjusted movements according to his new ratio. A golden globe, the size of a giant's head, was etched with numbers and symbols. Metal threads snaked freely over its surface. Ashiel connected lines and checked wires. The first scholar pushed the lever. The regulator jumped to life. Ashiel slid the golden globe onto a balance and released it to spin. There was a flash of light. Power surged through the wiring. Jeweled movements glowed. The stone floor shifted beneath their feet. 2 of the scholars toppled to the floor. What happened? Asked the second scholar as he helped the fourth scholar to his feet. 6 wigged heads jockeyed to see. Order was restored when, according to rank, starting with the first scholar, curious eyes confirmed the instruments were recording dual data. A pattern of small black pits emerged over the globe. They joined, breathing a murky, swirling darkness. Like the swaying of a viper before its victims, the pattern was hypnotic. Wigged heads bumped and swayed in unison, their forms elongated, bending to the golden globe. The scholars did not notice as their bodies drifted from material to immaterial. Sir, shouted Ashiel, I must cut the power. With a feeble wave of his hand, the first scholar signaled Ashiel to break the connection. Ashiel turned a knob, and the black holes vanished. Trembling, the first scholar flipped a switch. The whirling of the golden globe slowed. 6 scholars looked back. The sixth scholar looked sick. The 5th scholar was sobbing. This is too dangerous, began Ashiel. We do not understand the power. Power, you say? Shouted the 4th scholar. More power, agreed the 2nd scholar. Yes, that is all that is needed. You don't understand, interrupted Ashiel, but no one was listening to him. Gentlemen, choked the 1st scholar, the regulator works. All that is needed is more power. The 4th scholar hit the 2nd scholar on the back with a congratulatory whack. The 2nd scholar's false teeth shot out of his mouth and down the collar of the 3rd scholar. The 3rd scholar fell backward into the arms of the 1st scholar, who belched. That was it. Ashiel found himself standing amidst the scholars as they rolled on the floor, laughing. I must report this to Dr. Luce immediately, exclaimed the 1st scholar as he struggled to his feet. Take the rest of the day off. We all need to prepare for the eve of the time of congregation anyway. Let us celebrate early. Well done, well done. Gentlemen, we have achieved unification of infinity and interval. Ashiel was the first out the door. He broke into a run and was gone. Thank you for listening. To hear more of the story, please come back soon, or you may purchase your own copy on Amazon. Just follow the link below. Until next time.